Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. Today we're going to talk about an author who changed my life. I'm talking about the Uruguayan author Horacio Quiroga. I read him for the first time when I was in the 4th grade, so we are talking about a very long time ago. And back then, this little book, Cuentos de la Selva, or Jungle Stories, was pretty much required reading for every kid who was going to school in Argentina and probably in Uruguay, where Horacio Quiroga was originally from. Now, I liked the stories so much, and this was assigned reading. I loved these jungle stories. And one day, I was just looking at my father's library. We have it here just the same as it was back in Buenos Aires. And I found a little book by Horacio Quiroga titled La gallina degollada, so the decapitated chicken, and it had other stories in it too. So I thought to myself, hey, I like his work so much, let's check out this story. It has a very interesting title. And oh my God, I could not believe what I had just read with that story. And I'm going to tell you, that story, La gallina degollada, the decapitated chicken, remains to this day the most disturbing and also the most powerful short story that I have ever read. That story showed me the true power of storytelling, the power of storytelling to stir your heart and to shatter your nerves and even to turn your stomach, in this case almost quite literally, because it was one reading experience that I never forgot about, and I am sure that I am never going to forget about. Let me tell you a little bit about Quiroga very briefly before we go into his work. Quiroga is often compared to Edgar Allan Poe. You may have heard that. It's a good comparison, but as most comparisons, it's a little bit simplistic, of course. But the thing here is that we are in a very dark place. And we read the stories, they're very dark, and of course, we wonder why, what happened to this guy? Why is life so dark for him? And when you read his biography, it turns out that he had a really tough life. Let me tell you just a few things that happened to him, just so that you can see what I mean by this. At one point in his life, he was cleaning a gun for one of his friends, and he accidentally, while looking at the gun, shot this friend in the mouth, and his friend died. Okay, so even just that by itself is already awful. But then, for example, his first wife committed suicide. Then towards the end of his life, he was diagnosed with a very difficult illness, and they found out that it was a type of cancer. In the end, he ended up taking his own life, So we are talking about a really dark life for Horacio Quiroga, and you can definitely tell that by reading his stories. This is a very sad life story. Now, you may not guess this just looking at the influence or, the attention that Quiroga gets in the English-speaking world. But in Latin America, he is considered to be one of the masters of the short story. I mean, this guy basically revolutionized the genre. There's kind of like a, before and then after Quiroga in the history of the Southern Cone literature and in all of Latin America. He is really regarded as a master. And I would say that the effect that he had, looking beyond the themes and all that, the effect that he had is really comparable to the effect that Edgar Allan Poe had in the short story. And if you look at a little bit later, even the effect maybe that somebody like Ernest Hemingway had. These are the people who, changed everything for a certain genre. And in this case, Horacio Quiroga was, primarily dedicated to the short story. His style is direct. It is polished, very polished, and it is also quite poetic. So the result is really a really good mixture. Do you remember what Cortázar said about the short story? He said, the novel wins by points, but the short story wins by knockout. Okay, so that really applies to Horacio Quiroga. If you want to know what Quiroga is about, he is really all about giving that knockout to the reader. And I think, the one that I mentioned, we're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail too, La gallina degollada, or the decapitated chicken. That one really shows you what I mean by that knockout. So in terms of themes, style, influences, let's look at that a little bit. The title of his most famous collection after Cuentos de la Selva, or Jungle Stories, is Cuentos de amor, de locura y de muerte. So tales of love, madness, and death. And I think that by itself speaks volumes about the kind of themes that you're going to find in the work of Horacio Quiroga. That could be the title to his complete works, okay? So that's what I mean by that. And you want to add to that animals, okay? And you can see that, of course, in the Cuentos de la Selva, or jungle tales. Animals are very important as characters, so many of the stories that Quiroga wrote could be described as modern fables. You have animals who talk, there's personification going on, but I do want to say that the key word right there is modern. Okay, these are modern fables. They're not like your typical fable, like the ones that Aesop is famous for. The jungle, very important theme, very important setting. His main setting really is the jungle. And some of his stories you're going to see take place in the city, okay, some of the ones that are included in the collection that we're going to look at too. But for the most part, he really loved the jungle because he lived there for many years, and that is what he depicts in his stories. It's a very dangerous place. Of course, you don't need anybody to tell you that, but if you read the stories, you're going to see that he does not romanticize life in the jungle. Okay, he's telling his readers this is a very dangerous place to live in. And in the context of Argentina, what we're looking at when we say the jungle is basically the province of Misiones. So Misiones is in the northeast of Argentina. That's where you find Iguazu Falls, of course, in the border that is shared with Brazil and with Paraguay. So that is the setting of his stories, and he shows basically man against nature. Okay, he has great respect for nature. When he describes nature, you can tell that. How did he end up in Misiones? So remember, he was from Uruguay, he moved to Argentina, and he moved to Argentina actually after that accident with his friend. And at one point he accompanied Leopoldo Lugones. He's a major, poet, modernista in Argentine literature. They were friends. And he went with him to Misiones because Leopoldo Lugones was trying to research the ruins of the Jesuits. He actually wrote a book about them that Borges admired very much and included it in his Biblioteca Personal. So he went with Horacio Quiroga because Quiroga was really, really good at taking pictures, taking photographs, okay? So Quiroga went there with Lugones. He loved the jungle, and he basically stayed there pretty much for the rest of his life. He spent much of his life there. Influences, I promised you that. So I have this edition right here. It's from Alfaguara, so it's kind of thick. We're looking at 500 and something pages. Cuentos, escogidos, so selected tales. And this one comes with an introduction by Liliana Heker. And she tells us that, in her opinion, the main influences on Quiroga are Poe, of course, Maupassant, Chekhov, Kipling. So those are the four names that she gives us. And she says that the most important, actually, is not Edgar Allan Poe by Guy de Maupassant. So that's something to consider right there. Borges, okay, said about Quiroga at one point, he kind of dismissed him at one point in his life. He said something like, oh yeah, Quiroga is kind of like Poe plus Kipling, And yeah, if you think of the animal stories, and the horror stories, you can get something like that. But it's a lot more than that. There's more than that to Quiroga. And actually, Borges changed his mind later on, because he was going to include a book by Quiroga in his Biblioteca Personal. The problem is that he did not get the chance to write that little prologue. But we have the list of some of the books that he was going to include that he didn't get the chance to write the prologue to, and Quiroga was included. So you can see that he changed his mind about his assessment of Quiroga. Now, we mentioned those four authors. Let me add another one that I think is kind of obvious. Probably somebody else has said it already. Jack London. Okay, so you see what I'm talking about, Kipling, London, the kind of authors that so many people grew up with in the generation of Quiroga too. So what's going to be the approach to this video? I thought, the body of work of Quiroga, this is selected stories, it's like 500 pages, so we're talking about a lot of stuff, and some collections are not even included in this book. So what we're going to do is, I thought we would focus on what is available in English, okay? And what is most readily available in English is the collection The Decapitated Chicken and Other Stories, which was published in 1976 by the University of Texas Press. So that is basically what we're going to look at, because that is really the place to start. Okay, there's some thunder here, so it's getting dark here very appropriately for the topic that we're going to be discussing. Now, if you're reading in Spanish, I'm going to recommend to you the Alfaguara. I didn't say Cátedra, right? So you were expecting me to say the Cátedra edition. I'm going to recommend this one to you because it's quite comprehensive. Alfaguara put together this edition. And why am I not recommending to you the Cátedra edition? For the very simple reason that I don't have a copy, okay? I don't even know what it includes. just about 2 months ago or something like that, I went to a used bookstore here and they had a copy of the Cuentos of Quiroga from Cátedra. I had it in my hands, and it didn't occur to me to look at what the stories were included or even to buy it. It wasn't that expensive, so I could have done that. But surprisingly, I don't know what was wrong. I was probably sick that day or something, because that doesn't sound like something that I would do. Okay, so that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna approach then the collection in English by the University of Texas Press. And the first story that they included, which is from the Tales of Love, Madness, and Death, is The Feather Pillow, or El Almohadón de Plumas. This is his most famous story, very often anthologized. Every kid in school at one point had read it because it was assigned reading. And the first line in the story actually speaks volumes. That tends to be the case. It sets the tone for the story, but it's just very particular, the way that we hear about this. Let me share with you that first line, because it's very, very simple. So I'm going to read it to you in Spanish, and then I'll give you a translation there on the screen. Su luna de miel fue un largo escalofrío. That is just the first line. Rubia, angelical y tímida, el carácter duro de su marido heló sus soñadas niñerías de novia. So we have this idea, of a honeymoon being like, this horrible experience. Quiroga is just so economical. Okay, that's one of the things that I love about him. He's so good at telling you so much in such few words, and he does that wonderfully. Look at the names of the characters in this story when you read it. Okay, we have the couple, Jordan on the one hand and Alicia. Okay, so Jordan is a name that sounds kind of harsh, when you pronounce it Jordan. It has this idea of somebody who's big, important. Jordan, like the river Jordan and stuff like that. And of course, when you hear Alicia or Alice, what do you think about? I mean, I can't help thinking about Alice in Wonderland, this idea of fantasy and all that stuff, right? And you can find it in this story, maybe connected to this character. As in Edgar Allan Poe, you have the house, sort of reflecting the lives of the people that inhabit this house. So in this case, we're looking at a very cold place. It's a white place. It's empty, right? So it really reflects what's going on inside. And the story is about how Alicia at one point falls inexplicably ill, and we just follow the progression of that illness towards the final shocking revelation. And then at the very end, you get a paragraph that ends the story that is so clinical. Okay, so once again, we have a very good play with language, different tropes and different, semantic patterns that Quiroga used. He was very, very good at that. Now, besides the themes and the horror element and all that stuff, El Almohadón de Plumas, or the Feather Pillow, is just an excellent allegory of a loveless marriage. So there's also that allegorical dimension that you can explore with many of these stories. The second story that is included in the collection is titled Sunstroke, or La Insolación, if you look at the original in Spanish. And in this very interesting one, we see the events from the perspective of 5 dogs. These are 5 fox terriers, and they talk to each other. So there's dialogue. You see how they quote unquote think, and all that stuff. So it's quite a complete way of looking at the perspective of the dog. And what we have is a premonition. So the dogs see a man who looks exactly like their master, but this man is not their master. It's death. Okay, so I like that, the presentation of death as a doppelganger figure, and when the man literally runs into this double of himself, he collapses. Right? So it's a very interesting way of presenting things, and this is what the dogs see. And at the end, in the very last paragraph, very similar to what you get in the Feather Pillow, you get a very, very brief little paragraph that tells you, in very clinical terms, almost like journalism, what happened afterwards, after this man collapsed. So once again, Quiroga was like very economical, and that's what I admire about him, and one of the reasons why he revolutionized the short story in Latin America. The third one is The Pursued, or Los Perseguidos. This one is a story about madness, and it's a longish short story. It has also been published separately as a little book or a chapbook, or something like that. Almost as if it were a novella, but it's not really a novella. I'm going to tell you that. Okay, it's about 30 pages, so it's very difficult to have a novella when we're looking at 30 pages. And in this story, interestingly, Quiroga is a character. And there's another character, Leopoldo Lugones, his friend in real life. So we have two real people being the characters, or the main characters in this story. It made me think of that Borges story in which Borges and Bioy Casares are the characters, Tlon, Ukbar, Orbis, Tertius. So I thought about that as I was reading it, but it's a completely different thing. And in this story, the main person that we're looking at is a character by the name of Lucas Diaz Velez, whom the friends, Quiroga and Lugones, believe to be insane. So the story is about that fine line, between sanity and madness. And one of the things it asks is whether a person can be cured, somebody who has lost their grip of reality. Is it possible to cure them? To be honest with you, I thought this was a so-so story, especially for the length that it has. When you have a long story, you expect more. You're like, hey, you better justify the amount or the number of pages. And in this case, I don't know, I thought it was okay, but not really one of my favorites. Now we come to the Decapitated Chicken, or La Gallina degollada, and my friends, this is it. Okay, this is one of the most grotesque stories ever written. I mean, not even Edgar Allan Poe. Okay, I'm gonna say that if Edgar Allan Poe had read this story, if he had committed an anachronism there, he would have loved to have written it. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about. This one has as their central characters a couple who have 4 boys who are born quote unquote normal, but then shortly after their first birthday they fall ill, and they are left mentally disabled. So then the couple have a daughter, and they're in fear. You can feel the fear and the anguish, because they are expecting the same thing to happen to this little girl. But it doesn't. The years go by, and she presents no issues, and everything is fine. But then tragedy strikes, and how? Okay, I'm telling you, I cannot prepare you for this story. So if you're going to read one story by Horacio Quiroga, make it this one, and don't say that I didn't warn you, okay, because this is a very, very twisted little tale. It's a really cruel story. The reaction that I had when I was a little kid and I read this story, it just shattered me. And then I remember having a similar reaction to a movie many years later, and that was Seven by David Fincher. Okay, so I mean, it's just crazy, okay? But it's also a very good portrayal of a toxic relationship. You're going to notice that the connection between the wife and the husband is not what it should be, okay? So keep your eyes open for that. And one thing that I want you to notice when you read it, at the very end, I'm not going to tell you anything, but at the very end, notice how we are never exactly told what is behind the door, but you're going to be able to see it. It's amazing what Quiroga does. Okay, you'll see it and you're not gonna forget it. Okay, you'll have that image embedded there in your memory for the rest of your life, I believe. So it's really quite amazing. This is storytelling, if you ask me. I mean, wow. Okay, The Decapitated Chicken is just one of the most effective, for what it's trying to do, short stories in the history of the short story. So I hope that's not an overstatement. I don't believe it is. So check it out for yourself. And let me know what you think about this story if you decide to read it. After that, we have Drifting, or A la Deriva. This one is about a man who is bitten by a snake, so he gets on his canoe and he goes looking for help. That's it. Okay, so you get the perspective of this man being bitten by a snake, and that's it. So you're going to notice that sometimes the stories of Quiroga are written in such a way that there is no wow factor. Unlike, of course, The Decapitated Chicken that I just told you about. So he definitely has those wow stories, but he has stories that are kind of like flat, and in that sense, with this idea of there being no wow factor, he reminds me a little bit of one of his influences, of course, of the early Anton Chekhov. When you read the early Chekhov, you're like, okay, so what's the point, but that was the point. The point is that you have this just great realism, with no tricks, and just plain and simple. So that's what this story Drifting offers you, if you like, of course, that kind of stuff. Then we have A Slap in the Face, or Una Bofetada. In this one, a native is slapped by a gringo, and many years later he takes brutal revenge on this person. So what we have here is another quote-unquote flat story also in the style of early Anton Chekhov, I would say. But once again, we have great realism. Okay, you can really see, you can feel. He uses the five senses in his stories, so that's what makes him great. And this is where you see that Quiroga was way ahead of his time. You know, because now you read, you know what I'm talking about, one of those stories that are not really about anything, where quote unquote nothing happens. You know, I love those stories, by the way. But back in the day, that was unheard of. You know, most of the stories had to have some kind of a punch, and Quiroga is able to do that too. You know, but he also excelled at that more modern type of story in which quote unquote nothing happens. So if you like those, there are a few in this collection, not all of them, of course, but there are some that I believe you're going to enjoy. The next one is In the Middle of the Night, or En la Noche, and this is a framed narrative. So you have a story within the story, and the central story is basically about heroism. So a man at one point wants to brave a particularly difficult river, and he goes to do that, and he encounters a couple. And the couple tell him a story about the time that the husband was stung by a stingray. And that is what the story is about. So you get these great descriptions of rowing and the struggle against the forces of nature, which was something that Quiroga was so good at describing. Juan Darién comes after that. Okay, so the title in English is of course the same because we are talking about a name. I really loved this one. Okay, it's just a fantastic fable. I loved it. There's this woman who unfortunately has lost a son. Okay, so her son has passed away. And right after that, she finds a tiger cub and she adopts this tiger cub. Then all of a sudden a snake appears, and the snake somehow manages to give this tiger cub the appearance of a human. But of course there's a condition. Okay, there's always a condition when you're talking about folk tales and fairy tales, and this one definitely falls under that category. I found this one to be just an unforgettable story about human cruelty. Okay, so it's a very sad story also. And this is one story that I had not read before. You know, I read it in particular right now because I wanted to do this video on the stories of Horacio Quiroga that are available in English. So I just found it to be brilliant, and I'm really happy, you know, that I looked at these particular stories, because this was one that I had missed before, even though it's quite famous. Okay, Juan Darién. The Dead Man we have after that, so El Hombre, Muerto. This is a story with no plot, really. Okay, so we're talking about maybe similar to what I was saying before, these stories that have kind of a flat approach. And in this one, a man is walking and he trips on his machete, okay, and he is wounded, so he is kind of, you know, there in the face of death, and we hear his thoughts in that situation. So it's one of those stories that explore the survival, you know, and the fine line between life and death. Another thing that Quiroga was really good at exploring, especially when it comes to the context of the jungle. You know, there's another famous story, it's not included, but La Miel Silvestre, or Wild Honey, and it's a very similar kind of thing. Anaconda comes next, same title in English as in Spanish. It's another classic animal story, you know, and in this one the snakes realize that human beings are coming to their place, you know, to the jungle, and these human beings are working on an antidote to snake poison. So the snakes clearly feel threatened by this, so they gather in a council and they realize, okay, let's do this, let's get together so that we can decide what to do about this threat, human beings. So the whole idea of the animals in council reminded me of the Aesop fable, The Mice in Council, which is one of my absolute favorites. It's about politics, if you ask me, so it's a really good one. But Anaconda, the story by Horacio Quiroga, is kind of like a snake epic, you know, and you have two characters that are sort of antagonists. On the one hand, you have an Asian cobra snake, and on the other one, you have Anaconda, who is the queen of the snakes, and there's like a little rivalry going on between these two kinds of snake. And the interesting thing about this one is that the story ends with the promise of a sequel. And there is, as a matter of fact, a story titled El Regreso de Anaconda, or The Return of Anaconda, but unfortunately it's not included in the collection. But you can read Anaconda, the first story, by itself, and it's completely fine, okay? Next we have The Incense Tree Roof, or El Techo de Incienso. And I'm going to tell you, this was one of the stories that I did not really like that much. In this one, there's a man that happens to be a government official, but he receives the visit of an inspector, and the inspector tells him, hey, the books are not quite in order, so I'm gonna have to do something about that. So the man gets busy, he starts working on the books, having everything up to date and everything, and then he goes on a really long, arduous journey to find this inspector and submit the books now that they look proper to him. And that's basically the center of the story. And it is presented to us as something that Quiroga himself heard from somebody else. So as if it were something from real life. And let me tell you, it sounds like something real. It sounds like something that actually happened. And there is great narration, but I don't know, the story is just too flat for my taste, Not flat in the cool way that the other stories that I mentioned were, or maybe early Chekhov or anything like that. So I would say if I had to choose one story that was my least favorite from this collection, I would actually say, the Incense Tree Roof. I think this is the one that did not particularly speak to me. I would have skipped this one, if I had known what it was like. And then we come to the final story in this 12-story collection, which is titled The Son or El Hijo. This is also a classic in the Quiroga corpus, and it explores the relationship between a father and the son. Very, very well done. Okay, so he's really good at portraying these relationships, these connections between people. And as in the story Adrift or A la Deriva that I was mentioning before, what we have here is just a very simple event. There's this father who is waiting for his son, who left with his rifle, and he has not come back at the time that he said that he would be back. So you really feel that anguish, that anxiety of waiting for somebody. I don't know if you have experienced that, but I have. It's like waiting for somebody and you don't know if something happened to them, you have no way of communicating with them and you're just waiting and waiting, and you really feel it. And this story is just very short. Okay, so Quiroga does that in very few pages. And because of the ending, I'm going to tell you, this story reminded me of a famous story by a US author that is very often anthologized, but unfortunately, I cannot tell you which one, because if I tell you which one, just by telling you, I would be kind of ruining or spoiling the whole reading experience for you. And actually, I may already have said too much just by telling you that. So we're just going to leave it there. Okay, you'll see what I mean when you read the story, The Son or El Hijo. So we have looked at all the stories included in this collection, and the bottom line for me is that the short stories of Horacio Quiroga are just vivid, they are fascinating, and they are very often unforgettable. For example, the best example of that is of course The Decapitated Chicken. But that collection, the collection in English, The Decapitated Chicken and Other Stories, is quite brief. So a lot could have been added to it. We're talking about less than 200 pages. You could add a lot to it. Just look at this one in Spanish, 500 and something pages. But what I'm going to say is that even then, I believe that this collection is representative, and it does give you the stories by Quiroga that are always anthologized. You're not going to get anything from the little book, the Jungle Stories or Cuentos de la Selva. But let me tell you, that is often the case. Often you don't get anything from this book. This is treated as a separate thing. In my collection in Spanish, there's nothing from the Jungle Stories either. So here you get, Quiroga. If you like this collection in English, The Decapitated Chicken and Other Stories, you like Quiroga. And I just love this guy. He was tremendously influential for me. And I believe sometimes that this idea that I have, I want to be a writer, I think he's pretty much responsible in a very large part for that, because he was the first author that I actually admired, and I was a little kid, So that's what I want to say about Quiroga. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on the short stories of Horacio Quiroga. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.